ground shook for just 30 seconds. The devastation has lasted a decade. This weekend marks 10 years since a massive earthquake brought one of the world's poorest countries to its knees. Thousands came from abroad to help, but did they do more harm than good? Hello, I'm Adnan Nawaz. Today's newsmaker is Haiti's earthquake. January the 12th, 2010, 4:53 p.m. A magnitude 7 earthquake strikes Haiti. In an instant, the country crumbles. Thousands are killed, millions made homeless. The international response was swift, but 10 years on, the pain continues. In a moment, we're going to ask how much of Haiti today is conditioned by that fateful day. But first, this report from Adam Pletz.
Ten years ago, Haiti was hit by an earthquake that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The Western Hemisphere's poorest nation has been slow to recover. For months, demonstrators have been calling for the resignation of President Jovenel Moïse. They accuse him of corruption related to disaster relief funds. At least 17 people have been killed and scores injured in the protests. They have plenty to be angry about. Haiti has a deteriorating economy and is suffering political deadlock. And the UN says 1 in 10 Haitians won't have enough to eat in 2020.
We are deeply concerned about the protracted crisis in Haiti and its impact on the ability of Haitians to access their basic rights to healthcare, food, education, and other needs.
But the UN itself was responsible for an outbreak of cholera in 2010. It killed more than 10,000 people and was brought to the country by Nepalese peacekeepers. UN personnel are also accused of numerous cases of rape and sexual exploitation. A recent study surveyed 2,500 Haitians in communities where UN peacekeepers lived. More than 1 in 10 reported knowing of children fathered by UN personnel who have since left the country. And like those children, some Haitians feel abandoned.
Haiti has neither a mother nor a father, because 10 years after the earthquake, the palace should not still be in ruins.
The peacekeeping mission ended in 2019. But does the UN need to do more to account for the abuses its personnel committed? And what can the government do to pave the road to recovery? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
5 years ago, the Red Cross said it had built accommodation for 130,000 people. But an investigation found the aid group had only built 6 permanent structures. 4 years ago, more than 60,000 Haitians were still homeless because of that earthquake. I asked the country's Foreign Minister, Bocchit Edmond, what the situation is like now.
Yeah, it's a hard reality. The truth you have just mentioned about the American Red Cross. I believe they collected more than $500 million on our behalf, but unfortunately, we didn't see that money. And as you said, 6 little structures were shown for that money. But we unfortunately, it's the past. Okay, let's move forward now. Even though after the earthquake, I believe there have been some efforts made in terms of constructions and new regulations and new laws. But now the main thing is to enforce those laws and to make sure that the constructions now some rules are being respected. So can guarantee the security of the structures and we can any possible in the future earthquake we can be better prepared so we can avoid all those massive loss we have experienced 10 years ago. And I think that's the most important thing is to enforce the laws but I should say some efforts have been done in this area in this aspect regarding the laws of construction and something.
Are there challenges presented by the political delicacy of the president's situation? Jovenel Moïse is in his 3rd year of his term. The vote that brought him the presidency only had a turnout of 21%. And since the middle of last year, there have been violent protests against the government. Does that all make things much more difficult?
But indeed, whenever in any country, there will be, as long as there is political instability, It's always it is not a good thing at all for even economic growth, social stability, and economic progress. So therefore, I understand that, as you mentioned, there has been some protest, and I believe the President Moise has made a lot of efforts to try to call for a national dialogue and trying to solve those issues and put everything in discussion and see how we can solve together those issues. But indeed, the political instability due to those processes really hindered those efforts trying to rebuild or to have a much better country. But hopefully, very soon, we may have a political agreement between all parties, all sectors, so we can have a certain political stability and where we can have more foreign investment and to create more economic growth and more wealth for everybody.
In November, the president said we're in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. I mean, November is just a few weeks ago. And in that same month, the World Food Programme said that there are 4 million people in Haiti who still need assistance in getting the food that they require. So things are not as they should be. And you've mentioned the president's desire to have a political dialogue, but at the moment the opposition is rejecting all of that. And the Vatican has even tried to get involved, but still the opposition rejects dialogue. So where does that leave your government?
I wouldn't say the opposition. I would say some sector of the opposition. But I must tell you that some from the opposition, they have been, talking and having conversations with the president. And as you know, in every country, whenever you have an opposition, but we have some radicals and some, more willing to cooperate. But the president is still pushing for a continuous dialogue, still pushing for everybody, all sectors to come to the table and sit. And because all of us, all Haitians, we love Haiti, and everyone has a plan for Haiti. But let's sit down together and put all those plans to and see how we can move forward with the country. But I believe we can do that, and it's a matter of time, and we'll continue to push for that dialogue.
That's Haiti's Foreign Minister, Bocchit Edmond. Well, when the earthquake struck, a UN peacekeeping mission had already been in Haiti for 6 years. The UN's humanitarian response followed, but it faced significant criticism. John Holmes was the man in charge of it. I asked him for an assessment of his organization's work in the country.
Obviously, my concern was the immediate humanitarian relief operation, not the recovery operation, which is the thing that's been going on ever since then for the last 10 years, effectively. What I would say is that it was a very, very difficult context in which to operate in those first few days, weeks, and even months. Because although Haiti is quite close to the American mainland, it has a dysfunctional government, a dysfunctional society, which doesn't help to start with. Port-au-Prince, the capital and the main area where the earthquake had struck and where the greatest losses of life were, is a very cramped city. And one of the problems was huge numbers of people had been driven out of their homes by the earthquake and had nowhere to go, but there was no space to put them because Port-au-Prince is on the sea. Anywhere that there was any open space was actually a floodplain, so that when the monsoons came later in the year, any camps we put up there were going to be flooded. So you had a huge problem of a city full of rubble, and getting rid of the rubble took years, not even weeks or months. Impossible to move, very difficult to get into the place because the airport and the port had been struck. So there's a whole series of reasons why the immediate relief operation was slower to get going than we would have liked, and why, for example, providing shelter, which we had to do with tents because there was nothing else we could do at the time, was actually very difficult, and people had to live in very difficult conditions for quite a long time. So there were reasons why it was difficult at the beginning. I think overall, and we made some mistakes, there's no doubt about it. We probably didn't replace the leadership on the ground quickly enough because we didn't recognize how badly affected they themselves had been by the earthquake. They were traumatized and really unable to operate effectively, even though they've wanted to work because they felt guilty. So that was one problem. which we didn't tackle quickly enough. But I think overall, despite those weaknesses and mistakes, the relief operation was not too bad in the sense that people didn't starve to death, people had enough water, eventually they had enough shelter, and one of the main things we managed to do was prevent major outbreaks of disease, at least in the initial phase of relief. Of course, there was a big problem later with cholera, which may have been introduced, sadly, by the UN peacekeeping force, which were also there at the time.
I thought the overall accepted analysis of the cholera outbreak that it was indeed the Nepalese peacekeepers who had brought the disease to the country, which hadn't seen it for possibly a century. Just 1 month into that cholera outbreak, the UN had observed that there was a problem with the sanitation systems at the UN headquarters, where the Nepalese peacekeepers had been throwing their waste into a local river that people in Haiti and Port-au-Prince were using for drinking and for cooking. And yet the UN for 6 years, not until 2016, did Ban Ki-moon admit that it was the UN's fault that cholera had been brought into the country by those peacekeepers. Why did it take so long when the UN had already seen that there was a problem with the sanitation systems that the UN peacekeepers were using?
Well, that's a very fair question. I mean, it wasn't my decision, but I was aware that at the time, I mean, I left in 2010, actually my job later in that year, but and indeed the cholera started after I left. I'm not trying to dodge responsibility. I think the problem was, although in a way it was pretty obvious that the UN had been responsible for introducing cholera, not deliberately, of course, but by mistake because the Nepalese, some of the Nepalese peacekeepers had brought it with them. The legal advice was very strongly to the Secretary General at the time, don't accept formal responsibility because we don't know where that will lead. Now, was that the right decision? I would rather agree with your suggestion that it wasn't the right decision and that the UN should have accepted responsibility, because I think that did a lot to destroy the trust of the population in the UN and the credibility of the UN in Haiti. So I think it probably was a mistake not to admit that at a much earlier stage.
I completely understand that actually you left your post in the August of the year that the earthquake hit. But still, how do you feel about the revelations that continue to emerge? Just in December, a few weeks ago, the online publication, The Conversation, it revealed its research, having spoken to 2,500 people in Haiti who had stories to tell about how girls and women were treated by UN functionaries, whether they be peacekeepers or anybody else. And obviously there are also some international charities who have been accused of the same, but of mistreating girls and women and giving them either small amounts of money or food in exchange for sex, and girls as young as 11 having become pregnant, having to raise their children in poverty. And the numbers are quite incredible. 265 of these people, of the 2,500 that were spoken to by The Conversation, they spoke about children being fathered by UN personnel, and yet still they are on their own having to bring up these offspring.
Well, I think, I mean, I don't know the detail of those accusations, but although I have heard similar stories myself. I mean, I think those things that if they happened, and I don't doubt that they happened, are completely unacceptable. And I think it's a problem that peacekeepers and people stationed in these kind of areas around the world have had in other areas too, in the Congo, in Africa, that things happen between the people stationed there and the local population which are acceptable. Now, the UN has, in principle, a zero tolerance policy for anything like that, and certainly the humanitarian sector has a zero tolerance policy for anybody who is abusing their position in the most appalling way, particularly by trading aid for sex. That is completely unacceptable. Now, do we do enough to stamp it out? Probably not, despite all the efforts that are made. Do we do enough to accept responsibility for what's happened? Probably not. But one thing I would point out is that very often these issues are connected with peacekeeping forces, and the problem is that the individual national contingents of these peacekeeping forces are not fully under UN control, and therefore the UN only has partial ability to take responsibility or to control what they do, because they're also under the control of their national governments, who don't like the accusations that are made and don't like the scandals that are created. So I'm not trying to excuse what happened in Haiti as it's happened elsewhere, and I think it was particularly likely to happen in Haiti because of this dysfunctional society and a lot of poverty and a background of sexual abuse. One of the things we were most concerned about when I was in charge of the relief operation was indeed sexual abuse going on in the camps. That wasn't actually at that stage between relief workers or peacekeepers and the local population, but by people inside the local population trading on the vulnerability of young girls in the camps to do sex for money, essentially. So this is a huge endemic problem. As I say, I'm not trying to excuse what happened or remove responsibility for the UN. I'm just trying to explain some of the background to it.
Just look forward for us and examine what the organization can do for that country now.
Well, I think one of the major lessons from the earthquake, which we and other earthquake-prone countries, including Turkey, have to learn, and I think Turkey has learned this lesson, is that you need to be prepared for an earthquake to happen. You need to have that resilience built into the system, the way building standards are enforced and so on. Because another earthquake will happen in Haiti, as it will happen in other earthquake-prone areas. And although you can't stop the earthquake, you can stop it becoming a disaster if you have prepared enough, you have the right preparations in place. The emergency services have protections against earthquake damage, and buildings have protection against earthquake damage. The other thing I would say is that there was a huge determination after the earthquake to build back better, to make sure that what happened afterwards was better than what had happened before. I fear that that effort has been a failure for all kinds of reasons, and the blame can be attached in all sorts of directions. But I'm not sure that Port-au-Prince is a better place now than it was before the earthquake, and that is a matter of huge regret, I think, to everybody.
That's John Holmes, who initially coordinated the UN's humanitarian efforts in Haiti after the earthquake. So did his organization do more harm than good? Let's speak to two people. In Boston is Brian Concannon, a lawyer for the earthquake victims. Brian is also a board member at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Johanna Mendelson Forman joins us from Washington. Johanna is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, where she heads the food security program. She once worked for USAID in Haiti and worked with MINUSTA, the UN peacekeeping mission there. Thanks so much to both of you. Brian, there's this question about whether the UN should be immune from prosecution. Plaintiffs have tried to take the UN to court in the United States. They recently submitted a petition to the US Supreme Court trying to get a case because of the UN bringing cholera into Haiti. Should the organization be immune?
Well, it's clear that the UN has some immunity, but it also has an obligation to harm people obligation to give justice to people that are harmed. So within the UN's own foundational instruments, they get protection from national courts, and there's good reasons for that, but it's part of a deal. In return for that protection, they have an obligation to help the victims. So far, U.S. courts have said that the victims cannot sue in the U.S., which is a matter of U.S. law, but as a matter of international law, that does not affect the UN's obligation to give justice for the victims. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon admitted as such in December of 2016, where he took some responsibility. He promised to provide justice for the victims. That was 3 years ago. That justice has not come. It's been an empty promise, despite an acknowledgement of the obligation.
Johanna, why do you think that the UN, with Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General, in 2016, promising $400 million for those most affected by the cholera outbreak in Haiti, why so little, just a tiny percentage, so far has been dispersed in Haiti? Does the UN not have the money, or is it more worried, do you think, about setting a precedent where it may do, in future, harm to the people of a country that it's supposed to be helping?
Well, I think it goes to a bigger question of, one, whether the UN has the resources. The UN has always been short of resources because every country in the world is the UN, and it is dependent on other resources. I think there is a will, but implementing it is hard. And I think we ought to get back to the issue in Haiti, because there's a good question of how those funds are dispersed and who disperses them. The history of aid in Haiti has been one of much of the aid being siphoned off because of a high level of corruption, which goes to the broader question of governability in Haiti. So I think the answer to your important question is much more complex. You can have a will, but you need a mechanism as well. And right now, on January 13th, Haiti will be without all of its assembly and only a third of its Senate because there has been no new election. So there are much larger issues that affect the implementation of this settlement.
Yeah, we'll come on to the current day politics in Haiti as they are in a moment, but just a couple more things about the UN's involvement during its operations after the earthquake. This issue of the sexual abuse and giving a bit of food or a little bit of money in return for sex and then fathering children who are left alone with their mothers in Haiti. What's the situation here in terms of the responsibilities of the UN to oversee whoever works for the organization? Brian, basically John Holmes was telling us that we couldn't monitor every single interaction going on between a UN employee, whether they be a peacekeeper or someone in a suit or whoever they might be, and someone from the local community. Is that a fair defense?
There are some things that are complicated and hard to do, but there are other things that are easy to do. And the easy things, I think, are good sincerity tests. And one example on the sexual exploitation issue is the question of whether the UN even allows courts to take these cases. So under the agreement between Haiti and the UN, if a UN employee is brought before a court, the UN is obligated to make a determination as to whether that person was involved in his official capacities or not. You know, obviously, someone who's fathering a child, that was not in the official capacity, so the UN cannot say it was. But what the UN does is it just refuses to respond. So these court cases are stuck because the UN won't even tell Haitian courts whether or not someone fathered a child, whether that was in his official responsibilities or not. And that's a clear sincerity test. I mean, yes, it's hard to monitor every peacekeeper, but it's very easy to respond to a Haitian court. And this wasn't filed yesterday. I mean, these are cases that were filed 2 years ago that the UN just refuses to respond to a Haitian judicial summons.
Okay, Johanna, how much do you think the crisis that Jovenel Moïse is having to struggle through, having won the presidency, now in his third year as the leader, and at least 20, if not 60 people have died since anti-government protests began in the middle of last year, and he is accused of so much mismanagement. How much of all of that is due to what happened in 2010, do you think?
Well, I don't think you can link it directly to 2010 because from 2010 to the present day, there was much assistance that went into Haiti in a variety of ways. I think what we're seeing is a reflection of the ongoing crisis of governance, which has gotten even more fractionalized because of the situation in Haiti, the sinking economy, the weakness of the state itself, which got even worse after the earthquake because of the pure destruction that occurred in Port-au-Prince, and also a vast migration of talent after 2010. If you talk to young people that come from Haiti, they don't see any hope in going home. So there's also been a loss of a generation of leadership that is clearly affecting the ongoing governance crisis. But this is not a new crisis in Haiti. Haiti has long suffered these kinds of lapses in governance, and this will probably end as well. I think what we're looking at, and you talked a great deal about the role of international organizations, is the need for greater leadership in trying to bring together that dialogue that the minister talked about in the opening segment you had. And that has really not taken place. And unless there is an international consensus to come up with some support in trying to build a path forward, I think we'll continue to see the same type of crisis situation, which continues on and on.
So, Brian, would it not be fair to say then, would it be going down the wrong path to say that some of the problems were probably exacerbated because so much money from international organizations was given to Haiti, and that almost produced its own kind of circle of corruption?
I think that was part of it, but I think what's probably more important about the earthquake response was it was a missed opportunity. I mean, there were substantial resources available. At the beginning, there was broad acknowledgement with the UN, with the United States, with all the international community, that the first thing they needed to do was to develop the Haitian government's capacity to deliver basic government services, including the resilience that John was talking about, including filling a lot of the gaps that Johanna was talking about. But in the end, the international community did not do that. Less than 10% of the earthquake response money went to the Haitian government. Much of it went to very unaccountable international community projects. They ended up doing things that were easy to do, such as building hotels, luxury hotels, several of which have been closing in the last few months. They put a lot of money into an assembly manufacture plant that cost $350 million. It was supposed to produce 60,000 jobs. It's now closer to having 10,000 employees. So there are lots of things that were done quickly and cheaply. The intention was to get them done quickly and have something to show, rather than doing something that would make a sustainable commitment to Haiti's resilience.
Johanna, go for it.
Well, I just wanted to say, and while I agree with Mr. Concannon, a lot of the pledges that were made after the earthquake, and about half of American households actually contributed something to the earthquake recovery in the United States, is that many of the pledges from other governments were never actually realized. They were pledges on paper. So in fairness, the resources that were there were really fictitious. Now, that doesn't mean that they were misspent or that projects were not well guided. I would agree that there was a lack of systematized efforts to set up the government, but it's a much more complicated process than we see now. And there were missed opportunities. For example, the large industrial complex Caracol should have been all, used solar energy for its source of energy. In fact, it went to diesel energy in a country that has no natural resources for fuel oil. So that's just one example. But there are many missed opportunities, I would absolutely agree. But we still have to get from here today where we are to create a much more sustainable situation for the Haitians that remain on the island.
Johanna, Mendelson, Forman, and Brian Concannon, thank you so much indeed for taking your time to speak to us here on the Newsmakers. But that is it from this edition of our program. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.